Welcome to the Domestic and Family Violence in Culturally and Linguistically Diverse Communities. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Alison Alari and I'm the Injury Prevention Officer here at Injury Matters. So before we get started, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we meet today, the Wajanoonga peoples, and extend our acknowledgement to the traditional owners of the land in which people from across the state are attending. And we would like to pay our respect to elders past, present and emerging. So before we get going, just a little bit of housekeeping. As I just said at the start, can everyone please ensure their microphones are to mute? Additionally, we would also love to hear your questions. We have allocated some time at the end of the presentation. So we strongly encourage you to please send them through via the chat tab. If you send them through to the host, Joanna Collins, she'll compile them or we'll ask them at the end of the presentation. Also, if you have more than one person in the room with you listening to today's webinar, can you please send us a quick message via the private chat tab function and let us know how many people are listening with you. So I'd like to start the webinar by acknowledging that today we will be discussing family and domestic violence, a topic that can be distressing for some people. If you are or you have been impacted by family and domestic violence, there is help and support available. The services listed here can help you with safety planning, and this may include access to information, emergency accommodation, or help with legal issues. So a little bit about Injury Matters. We are for safer people and places. Injury Matters aims to prevent and reduce the impact of injury within Western Australia. And we do this through advocating and providing education for injury prevention, as well as providing support for those who have been impacted by injury. So today's webinar is brought to you through our No Injury program with the support of the Department of Health WA. No Injury is a statewide program which aims to enhance the capacity of injury prevention and safety promotion practitioners such as yourself and organisations to deliver quality injury prevention activities. So No Injury provides training, resources and networking opportunities, and I'll go into these a little bit more at the end of the presentation. So violence is a widespread problem in Western Australia. In 2018, 46 West Australians died due to assault, making it the 5th highest cause of injury. So interpersonal violence is commonly broken down into community violence and family violence. So today we will just be talking about family violence. In Australia, 1 in 6 women and 1 in 16 men have experienced at least one incident of violence by a partner. In 2018, of the 18,800 violence-related assaults recorded by the WA Police, over 61% of the assault victims were victims of family and domestic violence. In 2018, there were 37 homicides related to family and domestic violence in WA. So domestic violence is experienced across all cultural groups. However, many culturally and linguistically diverse women face many challenges in addressing violence and can be presented with several barriers when seeking help. Women from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds are less likely than other groups of women to report domestic violence. So during these difficult times, I think it's more important than ever to be talking about family and domestic violence and how we can support those in the community who are most vulnerable. So to continue the discussion on family and domestic violence in CULT communities, I would now like to introduce you to Elizabeth Lang. Elizabeth is the founder and Chief Executive Officer at Diversity Focus. Her areas of expertise include intersectional diversity and inclusion and domestic and family violence in cross-cultural contexts. She is a PhD candidate at Curtin University, conducting research on conceptualising domestics and family violence in the frame of collectivist cultures. That's her thesis title. She is also the author of the upcoming book, Wire for Bias. Elizabeth delivers Lifeline's national DV alert training as a subject matter expert. She's also a sessional academic at Curtin School of Occupational Therapy, Social Work and Speech Pathology since 2015, where she continues to lecture on a range of multidisciplinary undergraduate and postgraduate units. So I will now pass you over to Elizabeth.
Thank you very much. So thank you firstly to Injury Matters for the opportunity to present and speak on domestic and family violence, a topic that is, I guess, of huge importance to me as a practitioner and also as a researcher. So a lot of what I'll be sharing crosses over into the research that I'm doing, as well as our training program as well. So welcome everybody. I can see we've got about 60 people there. So if you do have questions, please put them in the chat box, and I believe Alison will be looking out for those. We'll have question time at the end. So perhaps make a note if anything I mention in the slides resonates or you've got questions about anything in particular. It may help to make notes earlier on, and then later on you sort of have an opportunity to ask. I'd like to acknowledge country and to pay my respect to the custodial owners of the land. I'm not sure if we're all from Perth, but various lands across Australia belonging to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. I pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging, and also extend this to anyone of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander background that might be joining us in the webinar today. I also want to acknowledge the fact that sovereignty never ceded in Australia, and I stand in solidarity for the ongoing struggle for recognition. I think it's also particularly important to recognise, given the topic that we are talking about and its connection, I guess, to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. So we can never, I guess, escape the history of Australia and the fact that some of the greatest forms of injustice against the family have and continue to be perpetrated against the family in an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander context. I guess in particular, if we take into account past and current systemic failures to protect women and children or the family within Aboriginal communities. I also want to echo, I guess, some of what Alison mentioned earlier about being aware of the lived experience. It is a sensitive topic that we're talking about today, and to recognise the prevalence of domestic and family violence, and in particular, to recognise the courage and the strength of those that have and continue to resist and survive violence and abuse. In saying that, we've already seen, just from Alison's brief presentation earlier around the statistics, just how prevalent it is in WA, across Australia and also globally as well. So I guess given the prevalence of domestic and family violence, it's not unlikely that often when I do these presentations or workshops, that there are participants that have a lived experience, whether it's a personal lived experience or it's a lived experience through friends and family or people that they know in the community. So I guess with that in mind, it's important for me to mention the concept of self-care and being mindful that with the sensitivity of what we're talking about, if people feel triggered by anything or feel the need to disconnect for a moment, by all means, feel free to do that. And if you want to reach out for help, I believe those numbers were provided earlier. So I just want to mention that, I guess, at the outset as well. I'm not going to present anything that's going to be hugely graphic, but, you know, different things trigger different people. So if you feel the need to disconnect, please ensure that you do look after yourself as well. I always start out with guiding principles. These principles, I guess, guide the work that I do more generally, but also speak directly to what we're talking about today. And these principles are being aware of the human rights framework and the understanding, we all know, that domestic and family violence is a violation of fundamental human rights. It violates a number of global treaties and conventions of human rights. Also the notion that people subjected to violence and abuse have agency. I think it's important that we keep that in mind, and that any interventions to support individuals are guided by this belief, because your approach is going to be very different if you approach somebody with a belief that they have agency than if you approach them with a belief that they needed saving and that you were there to rescue. Also to keep in mind that domestic and family violence is not a byproduct of any particular culture. We all know that gender inequality is a global phenomenon, and we'll talk about culture a little bit later on, but it's just important to be mindful, because I think sometimes, and I hear this quite a lot in workshops, people getting into discussions about it happens in this culture and that culture, and it's not denying the fact that there are cultural practices, for example, or there are elements within different societies that may be act as risk factors, but to blame it on culture, I guess it stigmatizes communities, but it also takes accountability away from people who use violence, and it puts it on an airy-fairy concept that we can't put our hands on. So it's about keeping in mind that accountability requires that we hold the issue of domestic and family violence on the hands of the person perpetrating it, and not putting it onto concepts. Also to keep in mind that people who have a refugee or asylum experience are not necessarily predisposed to being violent or abusive. There are particular risk factors that may heighten vulnerability, which I'll talk to, but the idea that you'll simply be abusive because you have a refugee or asylum experience, or that you will likely be subjected to it, according to research, it's not necessarily that clear cut. And lastly, this notion that we're all culturally and linguistically diverse. Now, I know that this term is used in the sector. It has a very specific meaning, and we'll talk about that later on. But just I want us to keep in mind that when we talk about diversity, that diversity exists because of the diversity of all of us. You don't have a group at the center that is somewhat neutral and everyone on the periphery is diverse. So I want us to keep that in mind, because I think when you have an appreciation that diversity exists because of all of us, it creates a very different experience to how you might engage and interact with others, because then you appreciate the fact that you have your own cultural lens and your own, identity, and others also equally have theirs as well. So this is an outline of what I'll be covering. I'll start off with some key terminology that I believe is very important to, framing what we'll be talking about. I'll look at the conceptual framework of domestic and family violence, and I guess some of the challenges that can sometimes present to clients who come from diverse cultural backgrounds. I'll talk about prevalence, and I guess more in particular around CAL communities, some of the problems associated with getting accurate statistics around domestic and family violence. I'll cover dynamics and diversity of experience of domestic and family violence in cross-cultural context. I'll talk about some of the barriers and considerations for disclosure when you're working with individuals or families. And we'll explore the notion of cultural safety within services and what that looks like. Now, in terms of actual list of services, I'll send that through to Alison, because I think there's no point giving you a slide of just a list of services. So I'll send that through to Alison, she can forward that to you. But I guess in that last point, there's just some key areas around cultural safety that I want to cover. So I guess to start off with key terminology, this is important because I guess when we think of the migration context, this migration context has a huge impact on what services they can or can't access in Australia. So we know that a migrant is somebody that crosses, say, an international border. So someone might move, I don't know, from England to Australia, so they've migrated. Because they have made a conscious decision to travel or to leave, and because they've made a conscious decision, they've probably had time to put their affairs in order, to say their goodbyes and do whatever they needed to do. So there's an element of choice and decision making, and very intentional decision making that comes with the migrant. The refugee is very different. So the refugee is somebody who is essentially forced to flee for fear of safety and security. And according to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the criteria for a refugee or to claim refugee status is that somebody is at risk of persecution due to grounds based on ethnic background, religious beliefs, political opinion, or membership of a particular group. So that makes them inherently vulnerable. So they could be a persecuted minority, for example, within their own country. Because a refugee has had to flee for reasons of safety, unlike the migrant, they didn't have necessarily the time to put any affairs in order. They've had to cross an international border, so they've gone into a country, and in that country have applied for refugee status. And once they're granted refugee status according to that criteria, then they are resettled. Essentially, once people are resettled, they're no longer refugees. So this idea, when we talk about refugee communities or refugees in Australia, it doesn't actually make sense, because once somebody's settled in Australia, they're no longer a refugee. The asylum seeker, however, is also seeking safety and security for very much the same reasons as a refugee, but the main difference is that they have not yet had their status determined, which means that they haven't been recognized as a refugee. But it's important to also recognize that every refugee starts off as an asylum seeker before they become a refugee. Because a refugee, firstly, had to leave one country, go into another country, so they've crossed an international border. And in that secondary country, they might have had a UN office, for example, or have gone through a process where they were recognized and then they were resettled. So the idea that asylum seekers are illegal is complete rubbish. Because seeking safety and security according to international human rights law is not a violation of anything. It's actually a human right that if you feel that you are persecuted or that your life is at risk, you have a right to cross an international border by any means necessary to save your life or that of your family. Now, Australian domestic law and the immigration, what's it called now? Department of Immigration and Border Force Protection, it keeps changing every couple of years, will tell you that, and I guess in the last couple of years as well, there's been quite a lot of rhetoric and media propaganda around asylum seekers being queue jumpers. I'm still trying to find where that queue is, by the way, or that they've essentially done something illegal. It's actually not illegal. But the difference is they've not had their status determined. A person who is stateless is somebody who does not have national identity of any country. And statelessness happens for many different reasons. It could be because somebody could be born into statelessness, where the country that their parents might come from, for example, and the country that they are now living in or flee or going to, differences in immigration laws across different countries can sometimes create a loophole that makes people stateless. It could also be because they're not granted national identity in the country that they actually belong to because they're not recognized within that country. They could be a minority group that's persecuted. So many, many different reasons that lead to statelessness. And I guess children born in detention as well. Now, the term CALD is I find it a very interesting term, culturally and linguistically diverse. So I guess in an Australian context in particular, particularly in this sector, it's used to, I guess, describe a group of people that are of non-Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander background that come from various different ethnic groups, but also not a part of the sort of Anglo-Saxon mainstream majority. It's a problematic term because, especially when it comes to, I guess, research or even working with clients, do people see themselves as CALD? I guess some of the issues associated with it is also, it is quite labeling and it almost polarizes, I guess, individual experiences under one umbrella. And when we talk about immigration context, there's such a diversity of experience. Someone who comes as a skilled migrant has a very different experience to a person who comes as a refugee or even seeking asylum or what have you. So But I guess within this sector, it puts parameters around a group of people to try and understand or appreciate that there is some complexity associated with some groups. And I guess also to recognize that there are groups within society that experience multiple forms of disadvantage compared to others. So I guess I could see the reasoning for it, but there are also problems associated with that term. Further terminology I just want to cover really quickly is the notion of culture. So when we talk about culture, we know that there's material and non-material aspects of culture. When we think of material, it's often the stuff that we can sort of tangibly see. Non-material being, I guess, the values and the beliefs or the social norms that are passed down from one generation to the next. It forms or shapes the collective consciousness of a group. It's not to say that everyone who belongs to a particular culture necessarily thinks the same. We know that there's diversity within diversity, but it does impact people's worldviews. When we think about enculturation, it's about somebody who is, I guess, socialized into their own cultural group. So a child might be born into a family and they're enculturated into the culture of where their parents come from. Whereas with acculturation, it's when you have, I guess, the contact of two different cultures coming together. So if I give an example, a personal example, I've got two young children. So my children, because they're born in Australia, but my background is South Sudanese, I guess they take on both elements of the Australian culture as well as the South Sudanese culture. They experience acculturation as opposed to enculturation because of that contact with where we're now living. When we think of the word settlement, it's a process of somebody, I guess it's a psychological process of somebody being able to effectively settle into a new environment. Do they feel a sense of belonging and harmony with that? Somebody may move countries or be resettled, but they may never settle, or it may take them 20, 30 years to settle. And when we talk about resettlement, it's a process of actually moving somebody from one country to another. The two terms are often mixed or used interchangeably, but they're actually quite different. So I mentioned earlier the terms around the key migration terms. So the refugee might be resettled into Australia, but it may take them 20 or 30 years to settle. So quite different. I'm just going to start off briefly with the conceptual framework of domestic and family violence in Australia, and I guess some of the challenges associated with that, particularly when we talk about, I guess, cross-cultural contexts or diverse communities. The typology of violence, which was developed by the World Health Organization, it categorizes violence into these categories. So it distinguishes from interpersonal violence that somebody might inflict upon themselves to violence within a family, so or between partners, to violence that may be inflicted by a group of people within the community. So, for example, if somebody experiences violence at the hands of people of authority, such as police or government forces, they are experiencing more the community aspects of that. But when we talk about domestic and family violence, it sits under the family/partner sort of umbrella, and we know that it can manifest in different ways. Including physical and non-physical. The threat of physical violence also constitutes it. Sexual, psychological, as well as, financial, social, cultural, spiritual, and many others. So we know that all members of the family can effectively be impacted by domestic and family violence. Now, I guess in terms of the definition, family violence generally, and I guess I'm talking more, broadly across Australia, abuse refers to abuse perpetrated by a family member towards another member of the family. Historically, the term that was used was domestic violence. And through the work of advocacy, mainly by Aboriginal advocates, pushing for the introduction of family violence in recognition that in an Aboriginal context, and also, I guess, in many other cultural contexts, violence can manifest not just necessarily between two partners, but it could be through multiple members of the family. It could be through I guess, kinship groups, etc. So in recognition of that and the work that was done by advocacy, I guess, with Aboriginal advocates, is what led to the introduction of family. So in Australia, or in Perth, in Western Australia more specifically, the terminology used is domestic and family violence. Now, in saying that, it does vary across different states and territories. I know, for example, I think in Queensland, it's still referred to as domestic violence. And legislation across states and territories is also very different. But in WA, I guess, and across the board, really, it's really that understanding that it's an abuse of power and control within a relationship. It's also a pattern of behavior, which includes a range of tactics. So those tactics could be physical, but they also could be non-physical, such as emotional, psychological abuse, or stalking, or verbal abuse, etc. And I guess inducing fear in a person as a means to maintain that power and control over them. People often mix up, you know, I hear a lot of discussions in workshops where people say, you know, they were both abusive, or it was sort of two-way. Domestic and family violence is very specific in that it's an imbalance of power. So there's other forms of, I guess, couple violence that may not necessarily be domestic and family violence. It's important that we are aware of that distinguishing factor, being the imbalance of power and control and the fear. So yes, you know, both couples fight, but you know, is one more afraid of the other? Does one feel that they don't have power or control, or that they have to submit to the demands of one partner? And if that's so, then we know that there's a clear imbalance of power within the relationship. Also, I mentioned that there's sort of variation across legislation. So we don't have a national legislation on domestic and family violence. In some states and territories, it's more expansive than others. Like I know, for example, in Victoria, their definition is much more expansive than if you look at the WA legislation. And that's because historically, you know, I guess all states have had very different experiences with regards to how the laws have changed. Some of the, I guess, challenges associated with the legislation around domestic and family violence is that the parameters placed around domestic and family violence, and if I speak specifically to the WA context, can present as problematic when we're talking about cross-cultural context. And that is because violence and abuse can manifest in ways that are very different to what the law generally sees in terms of mainstream white Western experiences of violence and abuse, such as multiple perpetrators, for example, such as the impact of extended family structures, and many, many other factors that can make the experience very different. And if you have somebody who come from a particular, I guess, cultural background with a particular migration experience, their issues in terms of what the legislation sees as domestic and family violence may be very different, because we know that dynamics within a family are very different across different cultures. Even the idea of what constitutes family is very, very different. And generally speaking, our laws obviously place these parameters with the understanding of, I guess, the family generally coming from a more white mainstream I guess, definition of what constitutes a family. And we know even in the mainstream, I guess, and I use the word mainstream, but I guess even when you think of sort of the dominant group within Australia, it's family itself has changed so much. And yes, the law has not caught up as quickly, but we can understand that if family dynamics are very different, or people's understanding and experience of family is very different, there's going to be issues with people in terms of how they identify their experience as domestic and family violence. We know that there's a gendered nature to domestic and family violence. We know that women and children are overrepresented in prevalence rates as those most commonly subjected to violence and abuse. And we also know that it's primarily perpetrated by men. So that is according to research. That's not my own belief. And we know that that's a reality. And when we look at the statistics, it's very clear. We also know that gender inequality is the biggest predictor of violence against women. So with that in mind, there are, and we'll look at some of the global figures shortly, there are differences globally, but it comes down to gender inequality. And you naturally find that in societies where there's a greater disparity in terms of gender equality, you generally have, higher prevalence rates. I guess that makes sense as well. I'll cover a little bit on prevalence. And I think some of these statistics sort of are in line with what Alison mentioned earlier. So we know that, so this is generally speaking across the board. 1 in 3 women have experienced physical violence in Australia. 1 in 5 have experienced sexual violence since the age of 15. I guess in terms of the cost to the economy, it's estimated at $21.7 billion a year. So that you can imagine, all the services that are required, whether it's hospital-based or community-based, prisons, etc. But I guess beyond the dollar figure, it's really the human cost. I think that is the most, that's probably the biggest, I think. And when we look at even homicide rates, on average, 2 women a week in Australia are murdered as a result of domestic and family violence. The statistics are simply too high, and I think there's a lot more to be done within this space to ensure that we start to see a shift. Sometimes people ask, is domestic and family violence happening more now? Or, and I guess it's hard to know because when you look over the years, it's become, I guess there's a national and a global dialogue around violence. And I think that has led to people then being able to speak up more, which you can imagine, I guess somebody might feel more safe to report, or there are services that are actually funded to support people, so people may be coming forward more. So is it increasing, or is it that it's simply more visible because there's more acceptance around the conversation? I can't say for sure, but I can imagine that given that it's still somewhat of a taboo topic, I think, but it's not as taboo as it was, say, 5 or 10 years ago. So I think that has an impact as well. Now, when we talk about prevalence in CALD, the statistics that we have in Australia are the national statistics. So they cover, I guess, the country. It's very, very difficult, as you can imagine, to get accurate and comprehensive data on CALD prevalence rates. I mean, firstly, the question is, how do we measure CALD? I mean, that's one, because there's issues associated with that terminology, and do people understand what it actually means? It's not lay language. The average person on the street does not know what CALD means. It's also do people see themselves as culturally linguistically diverse? Do people want to be labeled as culturally linguistically diverse? So there's issues associated with that terminology. I guess in terms of what we found through research, what I know for sure is that the complexity is very much there. In terms of actual statistics, there's not a lot of comprehensive or accurate information that can help us to say, okay, these are the stats in CALD communities. There's mixed findings with research that's been done looking at refugee background communities. Some research indicates that figures are consistent with national sort of figures, while some research indicates that there are higher prevalence within some communities, particularly refugee specific. Now, I guess the complexity of domestic and family violence is probably what the research highlights more than anything. And in particular, the additional, I guess, layers of vulnerability that some groups within Australian society have, which then act as risk factors which can impact on rates of prevalence. I guess also when we look at the lack of engagement with services, it's not often until sort of the pointy end of crisis that people will then come to the attention of services. And by then, often things have shifted and changed so much that it can be challenging to sort of backtrack and try and understand people's experiences and support them. But often I guess if I look at cross-cultural contexts, as Alison mentioned also in her remarks earlier, people are less likely to report to the police. And this is generally across the board, but I think it's more pronounced for some groups in society. And then more specifically, as I mentioned, that it may not be until it's reached a point of crisis that it then comes to the attention of services, whether that is the police or community services. When we look at those rates, I guess globally, you can see the statistics there. So these are by the World Health Organization. We know, so I mean, I'm not going to read because you can see for yourself. But I guess in terms of, there's a bit of consistency in that across a lot of, I think, regions. When you look at the European region, the Eastern European, Western Pacific, and sort of the high income countries are sort of clumped into one. So that's the average for the high income countries being 23.2%. When you look at the Americas, it's 29.8, the African region, 36.6, the Southeast Asia region being 37.7. So I guess globally, we know that the issue of physical and sexual violence and also the multiple forms of violence and abuse, the statistics are also quite high when you look at the regional sort of global statistics. I don't know if this is new to anyone or if people have sort of looked into statistics globally. I guess the experience of violence and abuse does vary, and there are differences globally with regards to, I guess, just other factors that countries have that create very different experiences for people that are experiencing domestic and family violence. But that gives you, I guess, a snapshot of what we're looking at in terms of global statistics. I spent a bit of time talking about the dynamics of power and abuse, particularly in cross-cultural contexts, and I guess to appreciate the complexity, which is what probably from research we have most information about. I guess I like to start with the framework of intersectionality, because I think it's particularly key to appreciating complexity. And recognizing that multiple forms of social inequalities will intersect to create entrenched disadvantage for some individuals and groups within society. It's not to say that when we talk about CALD or people from diverse cultural backgrounds or whatever term you want to use, that there's necessarily anything about them that makes them more attractive to domestic and family violence. But the reality is they're often faced with multiple forms of other social inequalities as well, such as challenges with engaging with systems, inherent bias within systems, so structural bias as well. And obviously we also can't deny the fact of discrimination and racism that is often also systemic. It's also, I guess, when we look at an intersectional approach, it allows for, I think, an appreciation of the complexities that are inherent within each context. Because I think it's easy to look at a group and say, or, even if for those of you that work more directly with clients, if you're seeing very similar stories from the same group of people, it's easy to sort of go, that's how it is in that group. And I think that's a natural human thing, because when you start to see patterns, you automatically start to form biases, and then that impacts the next client that you might see, who might have a very different experience. But then what that does is it removes, I guess, the context of the individual client, and then we start to operate from our biases where we look for certain things or assume they're going to say certain things, etc. And that can be very, very, very dangerous. It can also lead to an ineffective response or intervention on the part of the practitioner. In terms of using an intersectional approach, it also allows for a contextual understanding of each client. So I guess just to give you a little bit background to the term intersectionality, for those of you where it might be a new term, it's a bit of a buzzword at the moment, but it's been around for a very, very long time. It's only gained prominence, I think, in the last couple of years. But the term was coined by an African-American feminist scholar by the name of Kimberly Crenshaw. And if you're interested in looking at this further, she has a She's done a TED Talk about it, and she has an awesome YouTube video that explains it with her words, where this sort of came from. But the background story is she sort of works within the civil rights area and specifically within law. But I guess the appreciation of how multiple forms of inequality intersect to create further disadvantage came from an experience in the 1950s in the United States, where you had an African-American woman who was suing a factory on the grounds of two things. So her claim was that she was being discriminated against, one, because she was Black, and two, because she was a woman. And the factory's defense in the 1950s was, was it the 1970s? We're not racist and we're not sexist. We're not racist because we have Black people in our staff. We're not sexist because we employ women. And her argument was, well, that's true. You do employ women, but the women you employ are white. So yes, I'm a woman, but I'm not white. And yes, you employ Black people, but the Black people that you employ are men. Yes, I'm a Black person, but I'm not a man. So my experience is very different. And she was arguing that two forms of her social identity were intersecting and putting her in a situation of where she was being discriminated against. Now, at the time, the judge or the court did not understand and sort of dismissed it as, she was trying to double dip in disadvantage maybe, and they sort of dismissed it. But now it's hugely recognized, and the intersectional framework is used to appreciate and understand the complexity of individual experience. But I think it's also one that can be used and can be applied when we are, for those of you that are practitioners, when you're looking at how you can begin to address, I guess, the issues that your clients might be facing, using an intersectional framework will help you to appreciate that, yes, I've got this person in front of me, and domestic and family violence is a part of their experience, but they also have other forms of their social identity that give them a very particular experience, whether because they might be LGBTIQ+, or whether it's because they might also be a woman, whether it's because, they might be a part of a minority group within society. So they have other forms of their social identity that provide them with daily experience of disadvantage anyways. So it's a great framework to use in that sense to understand complexity, but also to apply a more holistic or more, relevant and sensitive approach to a person's particular context and what they need. In terms of dynamics of domestic and family violence, when research that I've looked at, looking at collectivist cultures, it's about the, understanding within families can be very different, which can sometimes put some individuals or groups at further risk, such as the example of multiple perpetrators of violence and abuse within a family. It may not be the husband, it could be the in-laws. It could be the in-laws that don't even live in Australia, who are overseas. So it's about understanding that because dynamics of family are very different, there are other factors that may place some people at further risk. And not because it's a cultural thing, it's just because there's other elements to the story that now make a volatile situation much more volatile. It's also about, when we look at beliefs and values that are supporting of violence and abuse, and we know that universally there are beliefs and values, even in Australia, that are supporting of violence and abuse. But in particular, in a client's particular context, if she's sort of living in a world where she's faced with values and beliefs that are very much supportive of the abuse that is happening to her, it leaves very few avenues for her to seek support and protection. And also, in particular, and again, and this is some of the challenge when I talk about cross-cultural context, because there's such a diversity of experience, because there's so many different, backgrounds and experiences and migration contexts, etc. But I'm sort of just going to use, different examples that apply to different groups. If we look at dynamics being, if somebody, when somebody comes to Australia, so they've migrated or they've even settled as a refugee, pre-arrival to Australia, they might have had protective factors that actually kept them safe, that no longer exist in this new arrangement that they have. So if somebody travels with their husband and their kids, the violence and abuse could happen for the very first time in Australia. And a lot of research looking at various communities has actually highlighted that there's patterns around the experience of violence and abuse for a lot of families happening for the first time once they've moved to Australia. And that tells us that it's because there are other factors as part of their new, their now, experience or their migration experience that have heightened vulnerability for the family or the individual within the family. And that's actually put them at further risk. So I mentioned earlier the protective factors being the extended family. That's no longer there. I guess other protective factors being other members of the community or other members within society who might have a specific role, that's no longer there. So that heightens vulnerability for that individual. So I think it's important when we talk about dynamics in cross-cultural contexts that we don't assume that it happens in those cultures or it's just a problem over there. It's just the reality is that the dynamics are different, and the immigration context could also add, I guess, a new set of challenges or other factors that the family may not have had pre-arrival. But also, I guess, keep in mind that when we talk about cross-cultural context, it's not necessarily people coming from overseas and living in Australia. You can have a second, third generation Australian who comes from a different cultural background, and their experiences again may be different. So it's not necessarily about this thing being around migration, because somebody could have, their parents could have been born here and etc. Also keeping in mind, if people had pre-arrival experiences, particularly of collective violence, whether it's direct or exposure to violence, can act as risk factors as well. In the graph I showed earlier of the typology of violence, the World Health Organization one, so you saw there one category being communal or collective violence. So if that has been a part of somebody's sort of experience pre-arrival, they've got another set of challenges that are also very, very different. I guess also strict and rigid gender norms, particularly harmful notions of masculinity, can also add to the complexity of dynamics. If you have a context of a family where there's very particular ideas around, gender roles, etc., that could also add another set of dynamics that as a practitioner you may need to be aware of. Also, that when we look at relationships, because I mentioned earlier that even the notion of family is very, very different across different societies and cultures. How people understand and experience family can be very different. So relationship dynamics can sometimes be negotiated in ways that I think to service providers can come across as either too complex or very foreign. And that's also another, I guess, set of dynamics to keep in mind. This is, just wanted to, I guess, cover the complex interaction. So this graph is called the complex interaction. It's used heavily within the area of torture and trauma rehabilitation. But I guess in sort of looking at this, if you were to have a client who might have had a migration experience around seeking refuge, they would have a very particular set of challenges that they're sort of grappling with if domestic and family violence is also part of their experience. So you've got a family at the center of that, and then you've got, if you have traumatic sort of experiences such as organized violence pre-arrival, that's something that sits in the background as a factor. The normal life cycle stuff, the everyday things that happen to all of us, births, deaths, terminal illness, etc., that is also part of people's everyday experiences. Then you've also got the experiences around migration, of exile, or the resettlement process, and some of the challenges that might be associated with people resettling. At the center of that, you've got the emotional, cultural, educational, and all the baggage that people sort of carry. If domestic and family violence is a part, and also not to forget the the sort of broader super system in terms of the engagement now living in Australia with the various systems. If this family is experiencing domestic and family violence, there's a lot in the background historically, currently, in terms of everyday life cycle stuff, you know, challenges around migration or settlement that you can sort of see, and even in just looking at that, you can appreciate the inherent vulnerability that an individual within this family may be subjected to domestic and family violence is experiencing. Because they have background baggage, they have existing baggage, you know, and then they have ongoing baggage. If they also have issues with immigration, that's also stuff that's happening in the background. So it's about appreciating, when we talk about complexity, that people are often dealing with multiple forms or multiple challenges at once. I'm going to wrap up shortly. I am very mindful of time. So I guess in terms of engaging with clients, some key points to keep in mind. We know that talking about domestic and family violence being a very, very sensitive issue can be very challenging. Even though there's a lot more acceptance around it, there's also still a lot of taboo around talking about the experience of violence and abuse. And it's not uncommon that people will feel these are shameful experiences, or they may be coming forward feeling that they're to blame for what's happened. So it can be a very difficult conversation to engage in, both on the part of the service provider, but also the person sharing their story. It's also about remembering that, you know, when we appreciate complexity, we try and understand people's contextual experiences based on what they have specifically gone through. The cultural background stuff may be relevant, but it's not necessarily, there's often more to the story than that. It's also about approaching clients with respect and empathy. And I think modeling what healthy, respectful relationships look like in your engagement or interaction with them. Because if you engage in a manner that's respectful, where you're providing them with information rather than telling them what to do, where you are, you know, helping them or providing them with information so that they can make an informed decision, you're modeling what it looks like to have a relationship, even though it's a very different relationship, obviously, as a professional and a client. But you're modeling what respect and empathy and what safety looks like within a relationship. Also, to keep in mind this notion that we're all subjected to the law. I hear a lot in workshops where people ask questions like, you know, clients come to me and they tell me what their experience is. I don't want to normalize it, but I also don't want to be culturally offensive. It's about keeping in mind that no one is above the law, and we can't normalize or dismiss or minimize people's experience of abuse because they come from a particular culture. It's still equally unacceptable. And I know people don't do this deliberately because people naturally want to serve their clients and they don't want to offend them. But sometimes in doing that, they may dance around the issue or avoid it out of a desire to not come across as culturally insensitive. And what that does is it creates a situation where there's not equity within services, where we're providing different standards for different clients. I think all our approaches have to be guided by the belief that everyone has a right to safety and security, and regardless of what their cultural background might be. And I think, and I know that, because a lot of people have shared with me that it's particularly difficult, because sometimes a client will say, it's normal in my culture. And then the person feels like, okay, how do I challenge this? Because I don't want to come across as insensitive. But we also can't take that to be the truth, because the reality is, no, it's not normal, because not everyone within that cultural group is abusive and violent. Even though the person may blame themselves for the violence and the abuse, it's still important that we challenge that. Obviously, we do that with respect and empathy, but it's important that we challenge that and not getting into a rabbit hole. Because I think if you start to say things like, if you ask them too many questions, if they want to justify, they will find reasons to justify. So it's about saying, I hear what you're saying, but you have a right to safety and security, and I am concerned about your welfare and well-being. So it's not, that way you're not sort of attacking someone's cultural belief or whatever they come with, but at the same time, you're also not dismissing or normalizing their experience. Because it's a recognition that it happens, that domestic and family violence transcends all cultures, all religions, all societies. And also lastly, to check and address any inherent biases that may impact on our engagement. Because the reality is, we all have unconscious biases, and often they don't come to the fore until something happens or we're triggered by something that somebody does or says. So it's about checking if we recognize that we have certain biases that may not be serving us. It's about checking in with those and ensuring that that doesn't get in the way of providing an effective response. In terms of handling disclosures, it's usually I do a whole training on this. So if it feels like I'm giving you just various, dot points, it's because I've got 40 minutes to cover this. So these are some basic but very key things to keep in mind. Firstly, that we listen. I think we often take for granted the importance of listening and actually being present when somebody shares their story. Being non-judgmental, believing what has happened and validating their experience. So validating the fact that, what's happened has happened and it's not acceptable. And affirming their human rights. And also the fact that they're not responsible for the violence and abuse, because often people will blame themselves for what's happened, particularly if the violence and abuse has sort of emerged sort of quite recently. Then the person goes, I must have done something because he wasn't always like this or she wasn't always like this. It's also about ensuring that we don't make promises, because the reality is we don't control all the variables. Yes, you will make referrals, but you can't promise that that's going to work out. You can't promise that they will get the support that they need. Appreciating that the client is often has the best measure of their own risk. We have to be very, very mindful that no one knows the person who is abusive more than the person who is subjected to that abuse. And so we must be guided by their measure of risk. If the person says, I don't feel safe, I feel like there's more risk to my safety because violence has escalated or what have you, that we take that to be the truth because they have the best indicator of risk within the relationship. Exploring what supports people have is also important because people will have internal and external resources that they could tap into. And that helps us, I guess, work with clients with, I guess, a more empowering rather than a sort of deficit approach. It's also about offering information and a warm referral. So it's one thing to provide someone with information about a service that may be able to support them, and handing them a flyer or a business card. And it's a very different experience to say, I know Alison who works at this service and she does X, Y, and Z. Do you want me to ring her and have a quick chat? That's a very different experience. Also, that any approach to supporting clients, which I know I mentioned this earlier in my slides, but it's very key, that any approach to supporting clients must be characterized by a belief that the person has agency and personal strength. Because we are not leading the way, it's their life and they're the experts of their own life. I guess in thinking about cultural safety within services, it's very, very key that services are culturally responsive in order to support women from diverse backgrounds. And culturally responsive, I guess, in terms of, do they adhere to the capabilities of cross-cultural engagement? Are they, do they approach their work from a place of reflection and awareness? Reflection in the sense that the idea that it's grounded in humility. It's about understanding and considering one's own experience and how that might be different to others. Having cultural understanding, and that doesn't mean to have a cultural encyclopedia of every culture in the world, but it's about our ability to reflect on personal values and belief systems and appreciate how they may be very different to our own context. It's also about appreciating the particular context of the client and placing the understanding of culture within context. Also understanding the impact of migration, the impact that migration background could have, and developing an appreciation for the intersectional factors that people will often be dealing with. It's also about communicating in a manner that's sensitive and responsive, both in verbal and non-verbal communication, such as providing information in different languages, for example, or providing interpreters, etc. And lastly, a service that is collaborative. So works in a manner that builds on strength and works towards creating consensus. So I guess they're the markers of cross-cultural engagement, and services that are culturally safe will work within these parameters where they're providing holistic supports, or they're able to engage with clients within their own language if that's a need or a requirement. I'm going to wrap up with these best practice principles. These are just some things to keep in mind, that when I guess any actions to addressing domestic and family violence have to be underpinned by a belief that all forms of violence are unacceptable and must be challenged. Again, regardless of people's, cultural background, etc. That women subjected to violence and abuse need the time to build trusting relationships, and that we can model that through our attitude and our actions as a service provider. And also working from a strengths-based perspective, so that we can shift and challenge abusive dynamics of power as well. And also that domestic and family violence, again, is not a product of culture, because we know that unequal gender dynamics of power are universal. That we must be aware of communication needs and act accordingly, as I mentioned in the capabilities, using interpreters or providing information in other languages if need be. And if you do work with an interpreter, and if it's a domestic and family violence specific case, actually briefing them if time allows. And lastly, to be aware of our own cultural context. To be aware of the cultural context of the client. And I guess also our own, because that it impacts on our worldview or the way that we might perceive or address clients. And lastly, that any intervention that we put in place is one that opens the door rather than closes it. Even if somebody comes 10 times to a service but they don't take action, if they are supported in a way that says it's okay, but we're still here if you need us, it's very possible that that person is going to feel more safe to return than if they feel like, oh no, I've pissed off the counsellor, so I'm not going to go there again because they won't help me. Also, that women subjected to violence and abuse are the experts of their own lives. As much as we try to be Superman or Superwoman, out of a natural desire because we want to help, we have to remember that this is a journey that started long before we came into the picture, and it's a journey that will continue long after we're out of that picture as well. So we have to be guided by that belief that they're the experts of their own life, that they have the knowledge, the resources and the skills. They may need a little bit more in terms of, and that's where support services come on board, but it's about, do we recognize and actually acknowledge their resiliency and their individual strengths? Because that is very, very key to any intervention. And that's all from me today. I'll take questions.
Great, thank you, Elizabeth. That was a really great presentation. I feel like there was a lot of information there, and yeah, just personally, it'll probably take me a few days to really to digest it and break it all down and unpack it. But yeah, we do have quite a few questions here. So one second, let me get to the top of them. So there's a couple of questions around the term col. So at the start of the presentation, you mentioned that you don't like the term col. So Charity Kaufman has asked, what other language can we use when we talk about different populations involved?
That's a really good question. And I guess some of the issues with the term CALD, and there's an article that was published recently, which I'll also forward to Alison, that may be of interest, that talks specifically about the problems associated with the term CALD. I guess it's difficult because I think sometimes it leads to a justification of ineffective responses. Sometimes people are sort of put into a box and then it's like that's their experience. I think it polarizes people's experiences and it doesn't recognize the diversity of experience that exists. And you'll notice that quite a lot within my slides, I use the term cross-cultural context. And I don't think that that necessarily may replace it, but the reason I prefer cross-cultural context is because of the recognition that you've got one set of, within an Australian context that is, you have one culture that is engaging with another. Because the Australian culture as a dominant culture creates a very specific experience for people. So I think that the merging of two cultures also, I think it creates a unique experience. It's very different to a person who is living within a country where then they're a dominant group. Their experience is very different. So I generally use the term cross-cultural, but I don't know the terminology. I'm still looking for it, and hence why I'm doing research in this area. But I do talk about collectivist cultures, and I do talk more about cross-cultural contexts, because I think that that gets to the heart of individual contextual experiences rather than clumping everyone together.
Yeah, okay, great. That's very interesting. Thank you. I have another question from Joanna Collins from Injury Matters, who asked, how can we advocate for changes in Western Australia family domestic violence legislation to be more inclusive of the cultural diversity in WA?
Very, very good question. I would say that, I mean, I guess, and I know recently, I think a couple of months ago, there was a series of consultations done they were sort of led by the Minister for Women's Interest and Domestic Violence. And it was around, I think, looking at the sort of, it sort of was in line with the national plan to reduce violence against women and their children. So there was correlation with that. But I guess in sort of advocating for change, I think there are sort of peak bodies that do a lot of advocacy, particularly when you look at sort of the Women's Council and others. I think it's about supporting initiatives where, you know, if there are consultations sort of being led by government, actually having a voice in those. Often I see it comes around sort of every couple of years where there may be different frameworks that are being developed, and then there might be a call out for people to come to consultations, or even for people to write submissions. I think it's important that services are engaged in those. And I think whether they do that individually or collectively is key. But I think the other part of the story is also the issue of representation, because I find that quite often, and there's some work that I'm doing with assets, particularly with Taranga. I don't know, some of you in this webinar might be aware of it, creating a community of practice that brings together communities. And when I say communities, I guess diverse communities and service providers and domestic and family violence services. And it's about the recognition that within diverse communities, there's a lot of work already happening at a grassroots level that is often not recognized and often, I guess, not, a lot of services might not know about. And it's about bringing those to the fore. And I think it's about providing an opportunity for diverse voices and diverse narratives to shape the conversation. Because I think quite often when we talk about cowed communities, it's often people talking about cowed communities from their level of understanding, from what they've read, and not from experience. So I think it's about working in hand with communities so that any intervention is informed by the lived experience, but also that people's voices are a part of that conversation.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Elizabeth. Another question from Charity Kaufman, who's asked, do you think it's useful in terms of progressing a new community language about men's accountability to distinguish between men as accountable individuals and men as an institution of manhood? She says, I find it problematic, the limiting English vocabulary to distinguish between the two concepts.
I completely agree, and I'm not sure that I have the answer to that necessarily, but I do think that there is a lot of work to be done within that space, because I think that particularly when we look at gender inequality, we know that the reality is we have a society that is divided on gendered lines that have, you know, and this is, I guess, universally as well, when we talk about patriarchy, there's a lot of beliefs around, you know, manhood or womanhood. And I think they sometimes, I guess, are problematic because it leads sometimes to justification of men's violence. The idea that men should be strong, should be stoic, should be not show emotion, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, I think that there's a lot of work to be done around masculinity and the notion of masculinity and manhood and womanhood as well. So I think you're right, but it's a very long conversation.
Yeah, okay, sure. Thank you. I think that might be all of the questions now. Sorry, there's just a lot of comments coming through. The feedback's been really positive. A lot of people have been very appreciative of your presentation. I do have one person here actually who's mentioned she has a couple who have come to Australia from Sudan. She sees them in the child health clinic. The mother wants to go to uni to study nursing, but her husband won't let her. The mother said she is adapting more to Australian culture and that her husband is more traditional. So what are some ways to have a conversation with these women around these issues?
That's a tough one. I guess, firstly, I would challenge the idea. Okay, I appreciate that he's traditional, but I would challenge the idea that education for women is a Western concept, because there are a lot of women, even Sudanese women, that are educated within Sudan as well. Now, I guess the challenge with women's education, particularly in the Sudan, is because of the civil war and all the things that have happened, it's created a situation where there were challenges to women actually accessing education and services, as well as obviously with war comes poverty and other experiences. But I guess in terms of supporting, it's a tough one, because I think you can't get away from having to have the conversation with him, because it sounds like he holds quite a lot of power and authority within the family. And I think that the best person to be able to guide that is probably the woman who's trying to get an education. Maybe it's exploring around, maybe with her, I guess rehearsing with her in helping her to have the conversation with her husband. What are the benefits to her getting an education? What are the benefits not just to her individually, but also to the family? Because we know it's a fact that a woman who's educated, the family have better outcomes in terms of, I guess how their children might fare at school, etc. So I guess framing that conversation around how does the family benefit? What additional resources can she bring into the family as a result of her education? And if she's able to understand, and she probably knows it, but if she's able to rehearse with you how that conversation can go down, that might help in I guess, her having the conversation with her husband. But it's a tough one. Yeah.
Great, thanks. We've got one more question as well, or I'm not too sure how to pronounce her name. This is from Oluwatosin. Her question is, you talked about understanding that victims have a better conceptualization of the level of risk they are exposed to. If a client says they don't think that violence will escalate or become more harmful, how do you convince them that it's not assured and to accept help?
I guess the best thing that we can do is, so when I said that, so the person experiencing violence and abuse often when I say that they're often the best measure of risk, they can read the dynamics of abuse within the relationship. They know that when things are starting to get heightened, that's an indicator that maybe there's going to be an explosion of some kind, whether it's physical or verbal or emotional. Now, if the client feels like because there are situations where clients lose sight of the fact that things could escalate. And it's not about, I guess, because we can't convince them in the sense that we convince them to force them to make a decision. But it's about exploring how safety could change. And I think using things like case study, is a great way to talk about it, or stories, particularly if you've had other stories of other clients where maybe the dynamics shifted very quickly and the person experiencing abuse didn't recognize that, and how that put them in a situation of further risk. And it wasn't their fault. It's just that there were other variables or other things that came to the fore that created, that heightened the risk for that person. So I think case studies and stories are a good way of helping people understand. And I guess in saying that, it's then up to the client what they do with that information. Because I think the best that we can do is provide information so that they can make an informed decision. But in saying that, if it becomes very clear to you that they're at risk or somebody's at risk, so if they say things like, you know, my partner's got a weapon, or they're outside in the parking lot and they've got a knife, we can't say, you know, how do you feel about that? Like, that's not the time to explore. You then effectively have to take very specific action, whether that is actually calling the police or reporting that to the person within the organization that needs to take action. Because there could be situations where people's lives are at risk, and that's when we have a duty of care to break that confidentiality.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you, Elizabeth. That is all of the questions for you. I thought it might be a good time now to mention that you are running some called family domestic violence training around COVID-19 next week, is it?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, which is a free 1-hour webinar next Monday, followed by some workshops. So would you like me to send out some information to everyone in a follow-up email about those webinars?
That would be fantastic. Thank you. It goes into a little bit more depth around, I guess, what I've covered, but in a little bit more depth, because I've sort of had to go through, because I had 40 minutes, as I mentioned. The webinar provides more of I guess, a background. And then the workshops go into a little bit more depth, in particular around, I guess, some of the specific risk factors in light of the current crisis.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Elizabeth, for taking the time to. I know it was quite quick, and there's a lot of information there, but it was extremely informative, and I feel like it's really given myself a lot to think about. And I can just see all the comments coming through from everyone else, and everyone's really appreciative and very positive about the presentation today. So thank you. I'm just going to grab the screen back off you.
Somebody else, sorry, what time Monday's webinar is? It's at 11 o'clock.
There we go.
But Alison will send you the flyer, and that's got the link to the registration for that.
Yeah, I'll send a follow-up email out over the next, probably this afternoon or over the next couple of days. Okay.
Thanks everyone for coming on board. I hope that was useful.
That was great. Thank you so much, Elizabeth.
Thank you.
Okay. Oh. Okay, so just wrapping up today's presentation, just some next steps, or I guess following on from today's presentation. No Injury or Injury Matters do have a few resources available, which provides a bit more information around family and domestic violence in Western Australia. We also do have a resource which is around injury prevention, culturally and linguistically diverse communities. All of these are available through the No Injury website. We do have a couple more upcoming trainings for this financial year that have been organised. So next week we have hospitalised sports injuries in Australia, and then we have vision and falls prevention webinar series. And then our last training of the year focuses on mild cognitive impairment and falls prevention in older adults. We do hope to have a new training calendar out for our 2020-2021 financial year, probably more towards the end of June. So keep an eye out for that. So next steps, if you're interested in to keep the conversation going from today, there are a few opportunities. So we do have an injury prevention network that do meet quarterly to provide, practitioners such as yourself throughout Western Australia the opportunity to connect with each other, and to share learnings and solutions in injury prevention, community safety, and recovery as well. So we also have our Connected program, which provides you with the opportunity to build your professional work network and to keep you engaged in today's conversation. So Connected is a networking program whereby you're paired randomly every second month with another person working in the space to have a 15-minute conversation. And as well, I will send out a SurveyMonkey link for evaluation. If you could just take the time to just complete that, it's really great to get your feedback and just to ensure that we're delivering training that is relevant for everybody's needs. And with that email, I'll send out all of the information and links that Elizabeth has also spoken about today as well. And these are our contact details for injury matters if you would like to get in touch to chat further about today's presentation or any concerns or interest in injury prevention as well. So thank you all so much for taking the time to listen today. And once again, thank you so much to Elizabeth. That was really such a great and informative presentation. It has really given us a lot to think about. So thank you once again, and I will include all the information in the email that goes out to for everyone. Great, thank you so much, and that's the end for today. Thank you.